Our previous work on evolution had gone through what is evolution, so the idea that it's broadly this change in a population over time. And then we looked at three different ways that, or things that can drive change in a population over time. So you have your sexual selection, you have artificial selection, and then the one we'll spend the most time on, which is natural selection. So this idea that the environment drives change in a population over time. What we're going to look at now is we're going to look at the tenets of evolution by natural selection. Evolution by natural selection is a theory, meaning that it is a scientific fact. It does not mean theory in the way that some people use it as idea or hypothesis. It means fact. And so in order for something, an idea, to get elevated that highly in science to a theory, you have to have a very large amount of evidence, and you also need to have a lot of foundational principles or mechanisms to explain how it works. So what we're going to go through now are those tenets, those foundational principles that are necessary for evolution by natural selection to act on a population. So there's an easy way to remember these, and that is VISTA. So VISTA is an acronym for the 5 tenets of evolution by natural selection. So these are things that would need to exist within a population in order for evolution by natural selection to act on it. So the first one is variation, there's your V. 2 is inheritance, there's your I. 3 is struggle for existence, there's your S. 4 is time, with your T. And 5 is adaptation, that's the A. So this is a helpful way to remember each of these tenets. So we're going to talk through what each of these means. To do this and kind of make it a concrete example, the example I'm going to follow through for each of these tenets is a population of insects that are exposed to insecticides. So these are chemicals meant to kill bugs. And we'll use this as an example to look how changes in the environment can drive evolution by natural selection within a population. So the first thing you need for evolution by natural selection to happen in a population is you need variation. Now, reproduction results in offspring with genotypic variation. So this means that their DNA is going to be different from their parents. The one source of variation in all populations is mutation. Every single time DNA copies itself for reproduction, it makes some mistakes. And this is going to lead to variation in bacteria, in your protists, your fungi, in your plants, your animals. Everything has mutation as the source of variation. Now, sexually reproducing populations have a second layer of variation that inherently gets added in every single time they reproduce. Now, the reason for this is that in sexually reproducing populations, this would be like owls and fish and cats and humans, is that you require DNA from 2 parents, where you get a random 50% from one parent, random 50% from the other, and you mix them together. Now, because it's sort of a random distribution, every single time the process of meiosis, which is what forms these cells with half of the genetic information of an organism, goes through, you get sort of this random mix of DNA. And so this is why no one looks exactly like their brothers and sisters, is because of this random mixing process, and it gives us more variation. So sexually reproducing organisms actually have an advantage over asexually reproducing populations when it comes to evolution by natural selection. So if we were to think about our bug example, this would mean that we would need variation where some of our bugs are resistant to insecticides and some of them are not. Now, in order for that variation to be meaningful, it has to be inheritable. So evolution only works on genetic traits, which can be passed down between generations. I'm giving you 2 examples here of traits that would not be viable examples of evolution by natural selection because they're skills. They're things that you acquire within your lifetime. First one is guitar playing. You can't inherit longer fingers, which might be an advantage. That can be passed down through genetic traits, but the actual skill of playing the guitar is something you learn in your lifetime. It is not encoded in your DNA. Same thing with shooting free throws. You might have better arm muscle definition. You might have longer arms, whatever gives you an advantage for shooting free throws. But unless you practice and put that time in your lifetime, you're not going to be good at it. And you can't pass that on to your offspring. So the example here with our bugs again is if we have that variation, some of our insects are resistant, some of them are not resistant, that resistance needs to be heritable. It needs to be genetic in order for evolution by natural selection to work on it. Now, variation means nothing unless you have a struggle for existence. This is that environmental pressure that's going to drive change, drive preference for one of these traits. And pressure is everywhere in nature. So we can look at different types of competition. So you have interspecies competition. So there you've got a bear and a tiger, so two different species competing. You have intraspecies competition. So there are two male rams competing. And then you also have predation, so where one organism is trying to eat another. If we look at sort of what drives these competitions, it's resources. Resources are limited in nature. There's only so much space, only so much food, only so many mates. So if you have an advantage, if you have a trait that gives you a leg up on somebody else to do better, and you can pass that trait on to the next generation, then it is likely that evolution by natural selection will act on that. So the example here is with our bugs. If our insects have a trait that makes them resistant to antibiotics, that is a huge advantage, provided there are insecticides. If you never introduce insecticides into that population, then those bugs that have that trait that makes them resistant, they never have that advantage. So you need that environmental pressure. You need something from the environment that's going to drive preference for that trait. Now we need time. So over time, advantageous traits, so a trait that gives you an advantage to survive and reproduce, becomes more common in the population. So for example, if we look at the one down at the bottom here, we see that we have red and green bugs and a population of birds eating them. The red bugs stand out more than the green, so over a long period of time, many generations of birds eating from this population, the red genetic trait gets less and less common until our entire population is all green. The example with our bugs would be if the ones that are resistant are the only ones to survive every time farmers treat their fields with insecticides, they're the only ones that are surviving to reproduce. So over time, we expect that more and more of the population is going to end up with that trait. Now, organisms have varying lifespans or reproductive periods. So some organisms take a very long time to get to the point where they're able to reproduce, and some organisms do it very infrequently. It's going to take longer for evolution by natural selection to act on those populations. So for example, an elephant. Elephants take a long time to become reproductively mature, and they reproduce very infrequently. They have a very long gestation period. It's 18 months. And they raise their offspring until they're an old age before they finally are ready to reproduce again. So an elephant will have a few offspring in its life, and they live a very long time. Mice, however, become fertile very quickly. They reproduce very often in their life, and their offspring turn around and reproduce more quickly. Evolution is going to be visible a lot more quickly in a population like mice versus a population like elephants, because mice, due to their short generation time and short period for when they become reproductively viable, makes them more likely to reproduce and pass that trait on more quickly. The example here with our insects, again, would be that trait, that resistant trait, would get passed on between each generation. The result of this is adaptation. So this is the last thing. So this is where your advantageous trait is now common in the population. So you've seen that full change in your population. So the population is adapted to the environment based on whatever pressure was found. So if we walk through our bug example again from the beginning, you ready? So we had V for variation. So I look at my population of bugs. I notice that the green right here represents non-resistant, and the red right here represents resistance. So I have V for variation. I have differences in my bug population. Now I need I. I need it to be inheritable. So that means this gene needs to be able to be passed on. Now it says right here we're looking at a chromosome, so we know it's a genetic trait, so it can be passed on, so it's inheritable. Now I need S. So this is survival of the fittest, or struggle for existence. So a struggle for existence, those are my pesticides. So once the pesticides get applied to this population, all of my non-resistant insects will die, and my resistant insect will survive. They did not have an advantage until you apply the insecticide. So there's your struggle for existence. Now we get time. So the survivor survives, they reproduce. They survive again, they reproduce. Every time insecticides get applied, it's always these ones with the trait that are surviving. So my time gives me more and more sort of commonness for this trait to get passed on until eventually I end up with A, adaptation. I end up with a whole population where this trait is now incredibly common. So this population is now adapted to the environment. So we're going to practice this in class, applying these VISTA tenets of evolution by natural selection.